The call came in on a Wednesday morning in September of 2003, and by the time the second cup of coffee was done at the Harlan County DOT yard in Loyal, Kentucky, 3 engineers from the State Rail Authority had already decided the locomotive was gone. Not recoverable. Not worth attempting. Gone. The engine in question was a 1951 EMD GP7 diesel locomotive, 245,000 pounds, 56 feet long, owned by a private coal hauler named Ridgeline Rail. It had been running the Cane Branch spur out of Cawood on a Tuesday morning when the timber trestle over Clover Fork gave way without warning. The rear trucks dropped first, then the weight shifted, and the GP7 went over the embankment sideways, coming to rest on a 35-degree angle in the creek bed, front nose down, cab tilted toward the water, both side rods buried in mud and river gravel. The creek was running 4 feet deep from 3 days of rain. The locomotive sat in 2 feet of it. A state rail inspector named Gerald Booth arrived Wednesday morning with 2 junior engineers and a clipboard that had a lot of boxes on it. Gerald was 44, had a master's degree in structural engineering from the University of Kentucky, and had handled 11 derailment assessments in his career. He walked the embankment, photographed the trestle wreckage, measured the slope angle, and calculated what it would take to move the GP7. He came back up the bank looking like a man who'd already written the report in his head. There's no road access to the creek bed, Gerald told the Ridgeline Rail Operations Manager, a man named Curtis Webb. The embankment's 40 feet, loose shale. You'd need a crane rated for 300 tons minimum to even think about a straight lift, and there's no stable pad surface within 200 feet of the locomotive. Ground's saturated. Any equipment you bring to the rim is at risk of secondary collapse. Curtis asked him what that meant in plain terms. It means your locomotive is a total loss, Mr. Webb. You file the insurance, you salvage what's accessible, and eventually the creek will work around it or you cut it up on site. I'm sorry. I know that's not what you want to hear. The GP7 was valued at $340,000. If you appreciate stories about old iron and the men who keep it running, hit that like button and subscribe so you don't miss the next one. And drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. I read everyone. Curtis Webb made 6 calls that afternoon. 2 heavy recovery companies in eastern Kentucky. One out of Pikeville, one out of Middlesboro. A crane company from Corbin. A salvage operation out of Harlan that had worked a few derailments before. Every one of them drove out. Every one of them walked the embankment. Every one of them looked at the 35-degree angle and the saturated shale and the 4-foot creek and said some version of the same thing. We can't put equipment on that ground. The liability alone. You're looking at total loss. We're sorry. The crane company from Corbin was the bluntest. Their operations manager, a man named Phil Slade, stood at the rim for about 4 minutes before turning around. He was 38, ran a fleet of 5 cranes, the biggest rated at 400 tons, and he'd worked a lot of difficult lifts in his career. Mr. Webb, Phil said, I've got a $1. 1 million Liebherr LTM 1300 sitting in my yard that I'm not putting on that embankment. The moment my outriggers touch that shale, I'm going in after your locomotive. No pad configuration fixes that. You need a clear, engineered surface, and you don't have one. I'm sorry. He handed Curtis his card anyway and drove back to Corbin. By Thursday afternoon, Curtis Webb was filling out the insurance paperwork. Then his phone rang. The man on the other end had a voice that moved at its own pace. Not slow out of stupidity. Slow the way a man talks when he spent 60 years saying only what needed saying and nothing more. Mr. Webb, my name is Doyle Combs. I heard about your locomotive down in the Clover Fork. I think I might be able to get it out. Curtis had heard that sentence 4 times already that week. Mr. Combs, I appreciate the call. We've had 5 companies turn it down. State Engineering says the ground won't support recovery equipment. I know what the state said. Gerald Booth was out there. Good engineer. Not wrong about the shale. A pause. But there's more than one way to work a creek bed. Curtis asked him what equipment he was running. 1947 Mack B-77 wrecker. Holmes 750 boom. My own rigging. The silence on Curtis's end lasted long enough that Doyle Combs filled it. I know what you're thinking, Mr. Combs. The locomotive weighs 245,000 pounds. I know what it weighs. I've been pulling coal equipment out of this county since 1961. The B-77 isn't going to lift it by itself. But I know this creek, and I know where the solid sandstone ledge runs under that gravel. There's a way to work it. If you let me come look, I won't charge you for the look." Curtis told him to come. Doyle Combs arrived Friday morning in a pickup truck that had seen better decades, followed by the 1947 Mack B-77 on a lowboy trailer pulled by a truck that looked almost as old as the wrecker itself. Phil Slade from the Corbin Crane Company happened to still be in Harlan County that morning on an unrelated job, and he drove past the access road just as Doyle was unhitching the lowboy. Phil pulled over. He stood at the roadside and looked at the B-77 the way a man looks at something he can't quite believe is real. The Mack was a big truck by the standards of its era, a straight-six diesel under a hood long enough to park a Buick on, a Holmes 750 boom angled back over the cab, dual rear axles, the whole machine painted a faded red that had gone the color of old brick over 56 years. The boom cable was heavy gauge, the winch drum visible behind the cab, the whole rig sitting on tires that had been replaced recently enough that they were the newest thing on the truck. Doyle climbed down from the lowboy cab. He was 71 years old, 5 feet 10, hands that looked like they'd been carved from the same material as the wrecker. He wore a canvas work coat and a feed store cap, and he moved with the deliberate economy of a man who'd learned to save his energy for the work itself. Phil walked over. He'd met Doyle Combs once, years before, at a breakdown on Route 119. "Doyle," Phil said, "you're not seriously going to try to recover that GP7. Doyle looked at him with no particular expression. "Came to look first. I've got a 400-ton lever I won't put on that embankment. What do you think a 1947 wrecker's going to do? The lever needs 80,000 pounds of outrigger pressure on solid surface." "I know." Doyle pulled his gloves from his coat pocket. "The B-77 doesn't work that way." Phil looked at the Mack again, at the boom, at the cable, at the drum, at the age of the machine and the man standing next to it. He was doing math in his head that wasn't adding up. "Doyle, I respect you. I'm telling you this as a colleague. That locomotive is in 4-foot water on a 35-degree slope. The GP7 weighs more than 10 of those trucks. You walk down that embankment and hook a cable to it. The best you're going to do is snap the cable and maybe hurt yourself. The worst is the shale gives way and you lose the B-77 in the creek." Doyle finished pulling on his gloves. "Phil," he said, "I appreciate that." He looked at the access road, at the tree line where the embankment began. "Now, let me go look at the creek." He walked away without another word, and Phil Slade stood by his truck watching the old man pick his way down through the tree line toward the sound of running water, and he didn't say anything else because he'd run out of things to say that Doyle Combs was going to hear. Curtis Webb met Doyle at the embankment rim. Together they looked down at the GP7, gray and massive in the brown creek water. The Holmes 750 boom on the B-77 couldn't come close to reaching it from up here. Gerald Booth's assessment was obvious from 40 feet up. The shale at the rim was fractured, the slope steep enough that a man had to lean into it walking down. Doyle looked at it for a long time. Then he turned and walked back up. "I need to see the creek bed from the other side," he said. The other side of Clover Fork wasn't accessible by road. You had to park at the old Colwood Mine Supply, lot half a mile up the spur, and walk the creek bank downstream through second growth timber and river cane. Doyle knew the path. He'd worked this creek twice before, once in 1974 pulling a coal truck off a washed-out Ford, once in 1989 when a logging skidder went through ice and settled on a gravel bar 40 feet from a bank. Curtis Webb followed him and said almost nothing because Doyle wasn't talking. Doyle moved along the opposite bank with his eyes on the creek bed, not the locomotive. He stopped 3 times, crouched, looked at the water, at the gravel pattern, at the way the current broke around submerged stone. The creek was running fast from the rain, but it was clear enough in places to see bottom. Doyle pulled a long steel rod from the canvas bag he carried and pushed it into the creek bed at intervals, reading the resistance, feeling for what was underneath the gravel. Curtis watched him and said nothing. After 20 minutes, Doyle stood up on the opposite bank and looked across at the GP7. From this side, the angle of the locomotive was different. The nose was down, but the rear trucks were higher than they looked from the embankment rim. The cab was tilted away from this bank, which meant the engineer's side was half clear of the water. Doyle looked upstream, looked downstream, looked at the tree line on his side of the creek. Sandstone shelf, he said, more to himself than to Curtis. Runs from about here, 40 feet that way. He pointed upstream. It's under 3 inches of gravel. Solid. Same shelf the old Cowwood tipple sat on before they tore it down in 1966. Curtis looked at the water. How do you know that? Because I helped pour the footings for that tipple in 1959, and the engineer who designed it had us drill test cores every 20 feet along that bank. Sandstone shelf, 6 to 8 feet thick, runs the length of this bend. He looked back at the GP7. Your locomotive fell on the shale side. This side is different ground. Curtis was quiet for a moment. You're saying you can work from this bank. I'm saying the B-77 can sit on that shelf all day long, and the ground won't move. Doyle looked at the creek width. 42 feet of moving water between the shelf and the locomotive. Cable reach and rigging angle are the problem, not the ground. They walked back to the truck. Phil Slade was still there when they returned to the access road. He'd been on his phone, but he put it away when he saw Doyle coming out of the tree line. Well, Phil said. Doyle opened the passenger door of his pickup and pulled out a yellow legal pad. He sat on a running board and started drawing with a carpenter's pencil, slow and deliberate. Phil walked over and looked at the sketch taking shape. A creek bend, a shelf marked on the opposite bank. The GP7 indicated as a rectangle on a slope, a line showing cable angle from shelf to locomotive rear trucks. You're going to cable it from the other bank, Phil said. Snatch block off the trestle abutment on the shale side. Running line back across to the drum on the B-77. Doubles the mechanical advantage, keeps the pull angle low enough that I'm not trying to lift it. Just rotate the rear trucks back toward level and walk it up the gravel bar. Doyle tapped the sketch with his pencil. Gravel bars 8 degrees. Once the rear trucks are on it, the locomotive's doing half the work itself. Phil studied the drawing for a long time. Then he said the Holmes 750 boom. You're not using it for lift. Stabilizer only. Keeps the cable angle from fouling on the creek bank if the line shifts. Phil looked at the B-77 on the low boy. Back at the sketch. He was running numbers, and Doyle could see him running them. Phil had a good engineer in mind. He'd built his crane business from 2 machines to 5 by understanding load angles and mechanical advantage better than most people who held degrees in it. The drum capacity on the Holmes 750 winch, Phil said slowly. What are you running? 3/4 inch cable, 300-foot drum. Pulling capacity with the snatch block configuration, around 60,000 pounds at the drum. Doyle looked at the GP7. I don't need to lift 245,000 pounds. I need to move it. Rotation load on the rear trucks once the nose is pinned is closer to 40,000 pounds. Creek gravel does the rest. Phil was quiet for longer this time. The math was working, and the look on his face showed it working. That might actually function, Phil said. It'll function. Phil looked at him. Doyle, if the cable slips or the block anchor fails, that line comes back across the creek at 60,000 pounds of tension. You're on the wrong side of it. I've been on the wrong side of parted cables before. That's not reassuring. Wasn't meant to be. If you're hooked on this story, take a second to subscribe and turn on notifications. These old iron stories don't show up on the algorithm easily, and your support is what keeps them coming. Thank you. Phil drove back to Corbin that afternoon. Curtis Webb called Gerald Booth at the State Rail Authority and described what Doyle Combs had proposed. Gerald listened, asked 4 questions about the sandstone shelf and the snatch block configuration, and then said, if the shelf is what he says it is, the load math is sound. I can't officially sanction it, but I'm not going to tell you it's wrong either. Curtis signed the liability waiver Doyle put in front of him Saturday morning and shook the old man's hand. It took Doyle the better part of Saturday to rig it. He drove the B-77 off the lowboy himself, backing it down a path through the timber on the opposite bank that he'd cleared by hand with a chainsaw the evening before. The Mack moved through the trees with the patience of something that had been doing hard work in tight spaces since Truman was president. The sandstone shelf proved out exactly as Doyle said it would. He walked it with a steel bar before he drove onto it, checking every foot And when he pulled the B-77 onto the shelf and shut the engine down to listen, the rock didn't shift by a fraction. He set his anchor at the trestle abutment on the shale side. The abutment was 1920s concrete, 4 feet thick at the base, still solid despite the trestle above it being gone to splinters. He rigged the snatch block to the anchor point with 3/4-inch chain and a shackle rated for 80,000 pounds. Then he ran his line from the B-77 drum, across the creek through the current, through the snatch block, and back across to the GP7's rear truck frame. The rigging took 4 hours. Doyle worked alone except for one man, his nephew Harlan, who was 34 and had been working with Doyle since he was 19. Harlan handled the far bank rigging while Doyle directed from the shelf, calling across the water in a voice that didn't need to be loud to carry. Curtis Webb watched from the embankment rim. Gerald Booth drove back out from Loyal and stood beside him, not saying anything, watching the rigging take shape below. By mid-afternoon, a small crowd had gathered at the rim without anyone inviting them. 4 or 5 men from the Ridgeline rail crew. A highway worker who'd heard about it at the diner in Colwood. A county road foreman named Dennis Prater who knew Doyle from years back and had driven out on his lunch break. Phil Slade came back too. He didn't say why. He just parked his truck at the road and walked to the rim and stood there with his arms crossed, watching. Nobody said much. The creek ran. The B-77 sat on the sandstone shelf with its diesel idling. The Holmes 750 boom out at 45 degrees, holding the cable clear of the near bank. The drum locked, the line running taut across the water to the locomotive frame. Doyle walked the entire rigging once more before he climbed into the cab. Every connection point, every shackle, the block anchor, the cable run. He put his hand on the cable at 3 different points and felt the tension in it the way a man reads something written in a language he learned before he could read. Then he stood at the creek edge on the sandstone shelf, looked at the GP7, and said something to it that nobody else heard. Whatever it was, he said it once, and then he climbed into the B-77. The cab door closed. The diesel changed pitch, and the drum began to turn. The cable came up out of the water in a slow curve as the drum took tension, shedding creek water in a fine spray that caught the afternoon light. For 30 seconds, nothing visible happened to the locomotive. The line just tightened degree by degree, and the B-77 sat on the sandstone shelf with all its weight settled into the stone the way Doyle said it would, not moving, not shifting, the diesel notes steady and low. Then the GP7 moved. Not much. Not dramatically. The rear truck assembly rotated maybe 4 inches toward the gravel bar, weight redistributing the way Doyle had drawn it on the legal pad. Just that. 4 inches. But the creek gravel shifted under the locomotive frame, and everyone at the rim heard it. A grinding low rumble that traveled up through the shale and into their boots. Dennis Prater, the county road foreman, took his hat off without knowing he'd done it. Doyle held the tension. Didn't give more throttle. Just held it and let the locomotive find its new resting point in the gravel. Let the weight settle. A man named Kurt Albright had run a Holmes boom out of Pineville for 30 years and told a 23-year-old Doyle Combs that iron doesn't respond to force. It responds to patience applied in the right direction. Kurt had been dead since 1987. Doyle thought about him every time he worked a pull like this. He gave more throttle. The drum turned. The cable shortened. The GP7's rear trucks came up another 8 inches onto the gravel bar, and the nose of the locomotive lifted fractionally out of the creek water, just enough that the mud seal around the front truck broke with a sound like a boot pulled from deep clay. Gerald Booth grabbed Curtis Webb's arm without meaning to. Phil Slade unfolded his arms. The B-77 worked in 20-minute intervals. Pull, hold, settle. Pull, hold, settle. The Holmes 750 boom held the cable clear of the near bank through each cycle, the old worm drive winch turning at a speed that looked almost too slow to be doing anything, which was exactly the speed Doyle wanted. The worm drive had a mechanical advantage modern hydraulic winches achieved with electronics and pressure valves. Doyle's was achieved with gear geometry designed in 1946 by men who understood that a slow, unbreakable pull was worth more than a fast one that could fail. 90 minutes after the drum first turned, the GP7's rear trucks were fully on the gravel bar. The locomotive was still angled, still tilted, but it was on solid ground on two ends now, and the creek was no longer running through the cab door. Harlan came across the creek on a rope line Doyle had strung at the start of the job and re-rigged the cable to the front truck frame. Different angle now, shallower, pulling along the gravel bar rather than across it. The second pull was slower than the first. The locomotive was heavier in this configuration, all its weight consolidated rather than distributed across the slope. The B-77 diesel ran hard for the first time all afternoon. Gerald Booth was doing the math in his head, recalculating, checking Doyle's logic against his own training, and finding that everything was holding exactly where the old man said it would hold. 2 hours and 40 minutes after the drum first turned, the 1951 EMD GP7 was sitting on the gravel bar with all 6 axles on solid ground, cab upright within 4 degrees of level, nose clear of the water. Doyle shut the drum down. The diesel idled. The creek ran past the locomotive the way it had run past the sandstone shelf and the old tipple footings and the trestle abutment for 100 years, indifferent to all of it. Doyle climbed out of the B-77 cab and walked the cable back to the GP7 and crouched beside the front truck frame and looked at the connection points. He checked every shackle, checked the cable end, stood up and looked at the locomotive the way you look at something you've been responsible for and have brought through. Phil Slade came down the bank on the shale side, picking his way through the loose rock. Gerald Booth came with him. Curtis Webb was already at the creek edge. Phil walked up to Doyle. He was quiet for a moment, looking at the locomotive on the gravel bar, at the rigging, at the B-77 sitting on the opposite shelf. "I had it wrong," Phil said. "I was calculating it as a lift problem. You worked it as a rotation problem." Doyle nodded once. 40 years in this business," Phil said. "I want you to know I understand what I just watched. Kurt Albright taught me the rotation principle in 1964, Doyle said. Most of what I know about difficult pulls came from that man." Phil put his hand out. Doyle shook it. Gerald Booth shook it after. He started to say something technical about the snatch block configuration, and Doyle listened politely and then said, "The trestle abutment's 1922 concrete. They don't pour it like that anymore. Anchor held better than anything I've rigged to in 20 years. Curtis Webb asked Doyle what he owed him. Doyle thought about it for a moment. He looked at the GP7, at the creek, at the Holmes 750 boom still extended over the water with the late afternoon light on the cable. "Fuel and Harlan's time," Doyle said. "That's all." Curtis told him the locomotive was worth $340,000 and Doyle had just saved it. "I know what it's worth," Doyle said. "Fuel and Harlan's time." Curtis wrote the check for $340. Phil Slade drove back to Corbin and told the story to his crew the next morning without embellishment because it didn't need any. He still tells it. Every new operator he hires hears it before their first month is out. Gerald Booth's recovery report went to the State Rail Authority with a full description of the sandstone shelf method and the snatch block configuration. The report is still in the Harlan County DOT file, passed around the eastern Kentucky towing community for years. Not because Gerald wrote it, but because of the footnote at the bottom. Recovery performed by Doyle Combs, Colwood, Kentucky, using a 1947 Mack B-77 wrecker with Holmes 750 boom. Local knowledge and period equipment accomplished what modern crane resources assessed as unrecoverable. The B-77 is still in Doyle's equipment shed outside Colwood. He doesn't take every call that comes in anymore, but he takes the ones nobody else will touch. The Holmes 750 boom has been recabled twice since he bought the truck in 1968. The worm drive winch has never been rebuilt because it has never needed to be. Kurt Albright's name is in grease pencil on the inside of the drum housing. Doyle put it there in 1971. The creek at Clover Fork runs the same as it always did. The sandstone shelf is still there under 3 inches of gravel, same as it was when the Colwood tipple footings sat on it in 1959. Some things were built to last. The men who knew that are getting fewer every year, and the iron they kept running is getting quieter. But the work was done. The locomotive came out. And a 1947 Mack B-77 sat on a sandstone shelf in Harlan County and did what a $1 million crane said couldn't be done because the man behind the drum knew the ground and the ground held. Thank you for staying with this one to the end. If this story meant something to you, check out the other Iron Witnesses videos on your screen now. There's plenty more old iron with stories to tell. Subscribe if you haven't yet. I'll see you in the next one.